Very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We thank you for the opportunity to share together on Let's Talk. We are discussing this afternoon a very important subject, and we know that you will be blessed, informed, and have your questions answered likewise. We are talking about marital rape. Over recent times, this has been a discussion in some Caribbean territories. Should a wife accuse her husband of rape? And perhaps we can say vice versa. We are going to be discussing that in a while, but before we do so, we invite you to bow your head forward for prayer. Eternal Father and our God, we ask that you will be with us as we share today. And we pray that you will grant us your peace and your wisdom in Jesus' name. Amen. So friends, those of you who are listening on Second Advent Radio, we welcome you. Those of you who are listening via SLC Adventist or SLC Church channel or Facebook Live, we welcome you just the same. We hoping that you are doing well. It is a good day, and I want to at this time introduce to you our special guest for this afternoon. We have with us this afternoon a distinguished panel. Let me go one by one. I'm going to start with the male. Generally, they say ladies first, but I'm going to start with the male this time. We have from the Caribbean Union, Pastor Amron Williams. Pastor Williams is the Family Ministries Director. He's also the Ministerial Secretary for the Caribbean Union, responsibility for watching over all of the pastors and pastoral affairs throughout the 10 fields of the Caribbean Union. He is an experienced counselor, family life director, and educator. We are delighted to have you with us this afternoon, Pastor Williams. Welcome to Let's Talk.
Thank you, Doc. It's my pleasure being here with you again, and I'm honored to be among such a distinguished group.
We have also with us from new to Let's Talk. Pastor Williams is not new, but this next individual that I will introduce is new to Let's Talk. We have out of the South American country of Guyana, we have a wonderful lady who currently serves as the CEO of Davis Memorial Hospital. She has quite a long list of accomplishments. I will share a few at this time. She's a professional social worker, parent educator and development practitioner. She's a certified family life educator, a leadership healthcare systems certified worker, emotional intelligence leadership coach, high court mediator, and as I indicated, she is also the CEO of Davis Memorial Hospital in Guyana. We are delighted to welcome to our discussion for the first time on Let's Talk this afternoon, Mrs. Beverly Chen. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. And I'll use the word, it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here with you.
Delighted to have you with us. And our final guest for this afternoon, we have a fairly large panel this afternoon. Coming back again, someone who is no stranger to Let's Talk. We have coming out of the United States Virgin Islands, a very competent attorney who shared with us on previous occasions and is back with us this afternoon. It is my delight to introduce to you Attorney Natasha Baker. Attorney Baker hails from St. Thomas in the United States Virgin Islands. She currently works as a federal prosecutor at the United States Attorney's Office for the District of the Virgin Islands. Prior to that, she worked as an Assistant Attorney General with the Virgin Islands Attorney General's office, where she served as a prosecutor and the director of the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit. She has worked as a legal advisor or clerk to 4 judges and a Virgin Islands Supreme Court Justice. We are delighted to have Natasha Baker, Attorney Baker, with us this afternoon. Welcome back to Let's Talk, Attorney Baker.
Thank you, Dr. Greene, and thank you for having me again. I'm excited for this evening's discussion and to be along with the distinguished panelists as well.
Well, we are delighted to have you all with us. I am just checking in on the folks who are viewing on SLC Adventist. It does appear that there is a challenge there, but we hope that that gets resolved shortly. But in the meantime, we move on by the grace of God. So this afternoon we are discussing the subject, as I said before, of marital rape. And it is a big subject. It is one that has occupied the attention over recent times of people back in Antigua, in Trinidad, etc. But the real issue is, can we have rape within the confines of marriage? And this question has implications for us as Christian individuals. And so, on Let's Talk, we like to deal with the tough subjects, the challenging subjects. Rape has traditionally been considered as something that happens outside of the marriage tie. A few Caribbean countries have enacted laws regarding the matter, and it is a matter that is being discussed in others. Since marriage and sex are gifts from God to mankind, such a discussion is important for the Christian. And so today on Let's Talk, we begin this very important discussion. I'm impressed for us to have a word of prayer at this time. So again, I invite you just for us to have a word of prayer. Eternal Father, be with us as we go into this discussion. We pray that you will take full control of the proceedings, grant your peace and your wisdom in Jesus' name. Amen. I want to begin the discussion this afternoon by first dialoguing perhaps with our attorney. According to the Merriam-Webster.com, it's an online dictionary, rape is defined as unlawful sexual activity and unusual, let me read that again. Unlawful sexual activity and usually sexual intercourse carried out forcibly or under threat of injury against a person's will or with a person who is beneath a certain age or incapable of valid consent because of mental illness, mental deficiency, intoxication, unconsciousness, or deception. I noted, though, that the U.S. Department of Justice put out what it calls an updated definition of rape. This statement was put out on January 6, 2004, so it's quite an old definition. And it states that rape is unlawful sexual activity and usually sexual intercourse carried out forcibly under threat of injury against a person's will or with a person who is beneath a certain age or incapable of valid consent because of mental illness, mental deficiency, intoxication, unconsciousness, or deception. So, Attorney Baker, talk us through these definitions from a legal perspective. Let's begin there.
Yes, so these definitions are definitely very comprehensive. When you think about rape, and it's more than just generally, it's more than just forcibly. We have two aspects of it. We have the forcible aspect, and then we have the statutory aspect, which involves age. But obviously, for the purposes of our discussion, we're discussing the forcible aspect. And that comes with a myriad of different avenues, which many of the definitions have covered. And those avenues essentially speak to the lack of consent. And where someone is not willingly engaging in an act, essentially, that's where you have rape. And so if you dive in some more into the definitions, it talks about the forcible aspect. So that's where, someone is conscious of what's happening. They're saying no, and the no is not being accepted. You engage in some sort of force, whether it's physical force or you use a weapon to threaten them. That's usually the aggressive type that most of society have a disdain for. Then you have the type where you're not conscious. And this one has had some debate because you have unconsciousness in different aspects. You have where you're intoxicated. A lot of times we're seeing that in the sense of narcotics. One prime example is, for example, like, marijuana. A percentage of marijuana is given, a person is sort of out of it, and then, they become sort of unconscious and rape results. They don't resist, but then they're not fully conscious of what they're doing. And there are other types of narcotics. I just gave one example. I'm not picking on marijuana, but there are many types of narcotics that can be used. They could be drugging of your drink. There's so many different types. And then you have a simpler type of unconsciousness where you're sleeping, and perhaps someone is sleeping and the person come in on them, and before they're able to wake up or be fully conscious of what they're doing, or perhaps they do wake up, but they're not fully in a state of awakeness. And in that sense, there's some sexual activity that happens. Now, that one is controversial because some people don't believe that you can, engage in sex and be asleep or in some sort of sleepy state. And then obviously there's other aspects, such as maybe you're not mentally competent to consent. So in a case of mental retardation, or perhaps you have you're in some temporary state of insomnia, or perhaps you're under some sort of anesthesia. Like if you had a medical procedure, perhaps you're just waking up from it, you're out of it. You see that in a hospital context. So essentially, there's so many different avenues that the definition covers, and you will see a lot of them in many of the statutes of the different jurisdictions. But all of them come back to the whole idea of whether the person could have consented to the act.
Very comprehensive indeed. I remember having a family life seminar, and one lady asked in a public forum, "Pastor, is it right for a man to have sex with his wife when she's sleeping?" I wonder if you would consider that to be that she's in an unconscious state. But let's.
As you mentioned that, Pastor, I actually had a case similar to that. It was, the person was sleeping, sort of, but then they were semi-conscious of someone being around them and touching them, but they weren't fully conscious of the actions that were happening. And essentially when they woke up, I think the actual intercourse had already happened, but that was the event that got them to be fully awake. But by that time, it was too late for them to essentially say no or be more aggressive about their stance on it. And so, it's a very controversial thing, because if you're someone who sleeps light, you cannot fathom how in the world someone can get that far without you being conscious. So it's tricky. That aspect is tricky.
Indeed. Well, Pastor Williams, a few years ago, it would seem strange that we are discussing rape among married couples. We understand that rape is, as the attorney clearly said, when there is force, there is lack of consent, etc. we do understand that rape is it oftentimes takes place outside a marriage relationship, and in most cases, with one person seeking his or her own interest about the needs or the respect of the other person. What are the conditions under which sexual intercourse between married partners might be considered rape?
Right. And I listened attentively to the submission from Attorney Baker. And I think, you know, in as much as the information, you know, talks about the mechanics of the action, yet I'm hearing things that are very relational. And so you hear things like consent and, you know, use of force in terms of not just physical, but, you know, relational or emotional. And so in the context of a marriage, from our perspective, one of the basic and foundational principles of a marital relation is what you call neutrality. And, you know, every aspect of the relationship not only thrives, but survives on the whole issue of neutrality. And so when there is not consent on one party's, you know, part, and, you know, the sexual relation proceeds, then that whole issue of not giving consent is what really constitute the, you know, the violation. And, you know, some people, as you know, would want to use the Bible and our socialization, especially in the Caribbean, you know, to justify or to go around, you know, those things. But the bottom line is, marital relation has to do with neutrality. And when there is not consent, or when there's force, or when there's a threat, that principle of neutrality is, you know, is violated.
So effectively, then we are saying that even within the confines of marriage, the matter of neutrality and consent needs to be considered. Let me hasten to ask another question here. You know, some persons believe that sex in marriage is a right and not a privilege. They cite the biblical text that says the wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. That's 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 4. Mm-hmm. It might be instructive to read the passage from verses 3 to 5, and I particularly want to read it from the New International Version. Permit me to share this. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields to it, or yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of control. Now, this is an interesting passage, and it seems to suggest, as I said before, some people use this to say that, well, you know, I'm married, my wife's body belongs to me, or the wife may say, I'm married, my husband's body belongs to me, and so I take it when I want to. What is this text saying? And is marital sex a right or privilege? Now, I want everybody to comment on this, but first, let me talk with the theologian among us, Pastor Williams. Let's see you first, and then I'll ask you others to comment.
And I see in your question, you know, you have given the lead in establishing the context by going to the previous verses. But could I go one step further?
Sure.
And look at the historical context in that. What were the precipitating conditions that occasioned Paul to give this counsel? And you go back from chapter 5 that talks about, you know, the kinds of sexual practices that were taking place in the church. Even, and Paul says that, some of them were not even practiced by the Gentiles. And so you had that kind of situation. And so there were some in the church who, saw sex or marriage as a bad thing in and of itself. And so they were promoting the whole idea of, look, if you want to be spiritually pure, you must be celibate. And there was even, consideration for those who were already married, but they were converted, that they should kind of, quit sexual relations. So that was part of the debate. So if you understand that background, you realize why, Paul was given that kind of counsel to the believers. That is, look, hey, you're married. Marriage is holy, but it has to be done again. The principle of neutrality, and it is so interesting with regards to the specific question that you asked. In addition to this passage, I was looking through some of the writings of Ellen White, because she has quite a lot to say on this, and there's some direct and very strong language for those who think that they can look at their spouse as property, as opposed to a person that is equal to them. And so I selected one. I don't know if it's very short, and I think it really puts the question in its proper perspective, Dr. Greene. And this is from Testimonies, volume 2, 380. And this is what she says: those professing to be Christians should duly consider the result of every privilege in the marriage relation, and sanctified principle should be the basis of every action. I thought that was so powerful. And once we have that orientation, then I think that we are well on our way to to getting a handle on this whole issue of what we call sexual or marital rape, and to realize that it's not really part of God's design.
Thank you so much again, Pastor Williams. It is, as we said from the very beginning, a challenging, controversial subject. I recall that a few weeks ago, on a discussion in one of the islands, a particular minister was asked, a radio station was conducting an interview, and they called a particular pastor, put before him, is this something that we should make illegal? And his response was, when it comes to marriage issues, I'm staying out of it. That was his response. But I want to hear from the other two panelists here. Sister Beverly Chan, you are a social worker. Let's hear your take on that particular text. Kindly unmute.
Yes. Thank you so very much for providing me the opportunity to share. I want to thank Pastor Williams for giving clarity, the kind of clarity that is needed in that text. Because without the meaning and the history and the context, those scriptures are so misinterpreted by people who do not know. And they take them just literally. All right. And when I say literally, I really mean just as it is. Your body is my body. My body is your body. We belong to each other. So that gives me the right to handle your body as I see fit. Okay. Now the question is asked, okay, the rights versus privilege. Okay. And I deliberately said, when I give appreciation for being here, I said it's an honor and a privilege to be here. All right. It is a privilege, all right, for a man in the context of the rights to a woman's body and in the context of a right for the man to his body. Within that context, it is indeed a privilege. But however, the term rights have been there's so much negative energies when we're discussing rights, human rights, everybody's got rights. And so there is a pushback with the concept of the term rights. It has been so derogatively coming across to people as this entitlement, which is also endangerment, right? But if we look at the word right by itself, okay, which is morally, something that's morally correct, it's just, and it's honorable. Now, if we look at a privilege is something that you do in awe, it's joy, but a privilege can also be given and can be taken away. So in the context of sex, right, it could be a right to a very great privilege. How does it sound? For a man or a woman, and I wear this gender lens, so we can't separate and we know the neutrality, okay, to say, it was such an honor, right? I feel so good. This was such a privilege, that these rights that we have can be so well articulated within the context of a relationship. However, this is a moral behavior situation that has driven the laws to be enacted to protect each other, okay? Laws are reactive. And there's a place for the law to react to help to protect society from ill behavior. You will help to determine that more often than not, the rights to sex within the relationship and the force, we say force, enforcement, and force and is no part of kingdom's desire in a relationship, all right? It's mutually, as Pastor explained, I wouldn't go that ground over again. However, when that is missing, okay, the privilege and the behavior that makes rights, this right, a privilege, something to enjoy. We talk of sex being a gift, right? When we take that gift and violate it into behaviors that doesn't, that's unacceptable, right? It is really a disaster within a relationship. Sex that is forced upon feels like an out of, I've done this work with so many women before, even as a social worker and counselor. Forced sex feels like lying on a sheet made of sandpaper having sex. You want to think that is? It's like sand, paper, rough sandpaper. Could you imagine what that is like with forced sex?
Pretty graphic illustration there.
On the other hand, right, when we treat it as a privilege, it's like having sex on silk. So we can choose whether we're going to have a situation of sandpaper in sex or silk in sex. Sandpaper concept is also more often than not, men, and I'm going to use men since it's so heavily skewed in that direction, are usually men in the main who engage in pornography. Pornography on an ongoing basis gives an addiction, it gives a behavior of brutality. And when they look at sex through pornography and for those long periods of time, they are of the view that they can do it and have it with a long period of time. So in the same way, they don't know the context. They don't know that these things are cut and paste. They go, and men also in masturbation, all right? And I think we'll come to that a little more in our question. But for me, right now, this is a moral issue, right? And one of the things, the burden of proof resides in the church, is for couples and marriages to understand exactly what Pastor Williams was saying in terms of the context in which those texts are written, so that they can have a full understanding that God did not mean that people are to behave inappropriately to each other in the sex act that is really a gift. Let's stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I do notice that you have spoken with a lot of passion there. Attorney Baker, anything you want to add to that, or a perspective you want to share?
I love the submissions. They were so eloquently stated, and my submission may be a little bit more, like I have no tolerance for it. I don't understand. I've tried to think in my mind how someone can justify, and worse yet, someone who is a Christian person, the idea of marital rape, unconsensual sex, and even in the context of marriage being something that the Bible condones, being something that Christianity stands for. I don't understand it, and I don't know a better way to put that. There's so many things wrong with it. If you're a Christian and we teach that, the whole concept of God's law and his idea of respect for him and respect for people is out of love, then you can't simultaneously agree with the idea of rape in the context of marriage. It makes no sense. I think that persons who, and I've seen some of the articles, for example, coming out of Antigua, where people have given their opinions on that there's no such thing as marital rape. If you're my wife, you're mine, and sex is for me, your body belongs. I don't understand how someone can say that and still proclaim to understand what love is, to understand their marriage vows, to understand what the idea of marriage means, to understand or to actually engage in the selfless act of love towards their wife. I think a lot of it is a lack of self-control. I think that, even if it's not lack of self-control, many people argue, and I've even heard pastors from the pulpit saying this, that if the wife refuses to engage with the husband, he has a right to take it. I'm sorry, what? No, there's a breakdown of the relationship somewhere that needs to be addressed. And clearly, yes, the Bible and God and Paul and whoever else spoke about it intended for there to be mutual relations, as Pastor Williams spoke about, in terms of sex. And in the ideal situation, both parties are always, in every circumstance for the next 50 to 60 years, willing to partake with each other. But where that is not the case, no, nobody has a right to just get it. You need to address the root cause of why, whether the man or the woman is not willing or consenting. If you are saying that you respect your marital vows, you're a Christian, you have self-control, and you love your spouse, you need to get to the root of the problem and then, try to solicit consent from that way. But I'm sorry, Dr. Greene, I don't understand it. I cannot rationalize with those persons. It does not make any sense to me. Maybe I'm missing something, but yeah, it's no.
Well, so attorney, you're saying then that from your perspective, and I think you're speaking personally there, I see the passion, that if you are in a jurisdiction where if this is not on the law books, where a man cannot, a woman rather, cannot bring a charge against her husband for rape, and that were to come up for discussion, that we definitely would say that, listen, that needs to be a reportable act.
Let me give you a prime example. In the US of A, here in the Virgin Islands, the US Virgin Islands, it is on our law books. We have a statute, it's the first degree rape statute. It lists various areas in which someone cannot consent to rape. And many of those areas we previously talked about through the definitions that we spoke about. And then the last sentence of the act says spousal consent is a defense. And it to me, it's oxymoronic in the sense that all the list of things talk about, okay, you're incapable, whether based on intoxication, some sort of idiocy or mental deficiency, you were forced, or you are in a state of unconsciousness. These are actual elements of the statute. So if those things exist, how are you to make a defense of spousal consent? Like, what does that mean? How does that look? It's two different things. You know, you can't be unconscious and give spousal consent. You can't be intoxicated and give spousal consent. Like, how do you marry the two? And this is just one example in our laws, which many of these laws are antiquated. To be honest, most jurisdictions have accepted that it's wrong. The international agreements, such as the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Women and others like that, speak to this topic. And so it's simply a lack of care from many legislators not wanting to make the change. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why, because in a court of law, to me, it makes no logical sense to marry the two. You cannot, there's no way you can have consent if certain of those elements exist. You know, and yeah.
I'm wondering, you know, the discussion, it actually caught me by surprise, to be very honest. You know, when the discussion started that they were considering making this a reportable offense, I was a little bit surprised that it was not previously a reportable offense. But there is something else that is a little intriguing here to me. Rape is typically perpetrated between males on females, unless with those cases involving minors where there may be issues of abuse. Why is this now becoming an issue? What has changed over the years? Is it a situation where women have been silent? Is it something that was happening and women were silent, they were not speaking out? Why has it all of a sudden become such a debate? I don't know which one of you wants to respond to that.
Right.
Go ahead.
If I may. I think that, you know, and I think I alluded to it earlier about the way we've been socialized and, you know, to accept certain things. I was taken aback when I read some time ago one of the earlier definitions of rape, and it states all these things that you would do to a woman, and about forcible entry and all of the violence. And then the last phrase says, except it's your spouse. So what I understood in that was that it would be rape to do this to, you know, any other human being except your spouse. And that is what struck me. So there was that sense of insensitivity, that notion that, you know, this is my property, this is my right. And when you have a right, nobody can stop you. So I think we are emerging from that kind of archaic understanding, and people are being enlightened. More than that, you know, when somebody, you know, is suffering in a relationship over time, they eventually either become so disgusted or they get the courage, you know, to stand up. So I think that's one of the things that might be one of the reasons why people are so inclined now to assert this God-given right of maintaining autonomy over your body.
Sister Chan, just before you comment, I find it interesting that we have no questions from our viewers as yet. It is true that one of our channels is not up and running, SLC Adventist. That happens to be the channel where we generally have most of our viewers. But SLC Church channel is on, and we are live on Second Advent Radio. If you do have a question, the surest way to ask your question is to click on to, the easiest way I would say, is to click on to SLC Adventist Church channel on YouTube, that is, and submit your question in the chat there. Go right ahead, Sister Chan.
Thank you very much, Pastor. As I sit here listening to the submission, a deep pity has entered my soul. And to see that something that God has given to us from the beginning has evolved in such it's just a masterpiece of error. Traditionally, what happened is that people suffered in silence. They suffered because they felt that it was the right thing to do. The marriage vows that I belong to you and you belong to me, the two shall be one, has really put women in a position of consistent pain and hurt. I want to share with you two quick examples. This was a woman, she was about 27 years old, and she had 6 children. Can you imagine that? So they called me in an emergency meeting to talk with her. When I heard how many children she had in that short space of time, I said, that's a lot of children for that space of time. And her words to me were, and the Bible says that my body belongs to my husband. And the Bible says I must submit myself to my husband. Well, this is what I got for it. That was the Wednesday, and she died the Friday. Her body, they were poor, and her body could not take the force and the rapidity, the consistency of sex. When God says we belong to each other, as Pastor Clark, it doesn't mean sex 7 days a week and twice on Sundays. And the only time you have a privilege to say no or to step back is when we're going to pray. All right. So the context in which the second one was, this was a young couple. They came to me. I sat, the girls, and before the male sat down, we didn't pray. We didn't start a conversation. His words to me were, and the Bible says, she must submit to me. And so it's amazing how God, people in the church will use God's word out of context, an isolated text, not looking at scripture upon scripture, not looking at a whole scenario, but will use that to support their behavior with each other. It is pathetic. So women traditionally hurt. Women are a little more, when you talk about women's liberation in terms of brought this to the fore, women are much more empowered. Knowledge is power when it's applied. And more women are employed, they're working, and the desires for sex has been so corroded. In fact, when we look at interest, why you don't have interest? He may not have interest. A man who is hooked on pornography and masturbation, his interest for sex with his wife decreases. I've counseled people in those scenarios. Okay? Women who suffer abuse, childhood abuse, trauma. Women and men are profoundly different in their approach towards sex. And unless those differences are clarified, unless we appreciate what they are and work from that perspective, then we will continue to have this sexual dysfunctioning within marriage. When a situation has reached the court and a woman has to apply, that's not a relationship. That's not the marriage you're talking about. Okay, because in the context of what marriage is about, it's not about a fight over sex, which has evolved into more marriages having fights over sex. Women and men are made up differently. And Helen White, my favorite author, says we are different by God's design. God knows why a man's need for sex is different from that of a woman's. And so unless we understand these needs and find this middle ground to satisfy our needs, the fight, this disinterest and the contradictions will continue. And this speaks to the role the church has in having programs with a scale, an intensity, and a scope that will help couples to understand the dynamics of the neutrality of these relationships and not holding on to selected verses of the scripture to maintain these obnoxious behaviors within the marital affair.
Well, you know, you are introducing something there that I think some males in some quarters may want to challenge. There are some individuals who will say that the emphasis on woman's liberation is a departure from the biblical injunction for men to rule over the woman. They go back to Genesis 3:16 in support of this position. Is this justifiable? We're really, because what I'm hearing is individuals saying, you know, when I'm married, my wife, she is supposed to be subject to me. And then they quote Genesis 3:16. When Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, God said to Eve, thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And so some men say, well, this means that if I want to have sexual intercourse with my wife, she has no right to say no. Now, we don't have much time, so I'm going to ask you all to be brief on this one.
Just a quick word on that. We would know I'm not a theologian. However, we would know the concept of rule as given in the Genesis account. What we use as power over is really not the original context. Rule in the Genesis story comes from the Hebrew word that means masal, and not rather, which is ruling of animals. Theologians will know that masal means my husband shall rule over me. He shall care, protect, guide, honor, and those flavors to the relationship. But because within the English one, we use the word rule as a cross the board phenomenon, then we rule over you. The other thing too about that wasn't a prescription after sin. It was a description of a situation that will now happen because of sin, because that was not what God prescribed in the beginning. So he just described what will happen now because of the fall, but not description. But the context in which the word rule has been misinterpreted by people, the husband shall rule over you, is really not. And I salute the theologians to make more sense of this than I can. I thank you.
Also, Williams, I see you smiling. She's not a theologian.
A theologian has spoken already.
I tell you.
So, but just quickly, and I want to, one of the things, and I'm going back, to my original submission, because my thesis statement in all of this discussion is the matter of neutrality must be at the center of the relationship. And in therapy, when you're dealing with individuals who have divergent views, your goal is to find common ground to bring them together. And so I just want to throw in some different common ground, because I know that this is a very hot topic, highly contested topic, especially for men talking about their rights. And, I married you, and again, Sister Chan talk about the differences in terms of how we, the sexes are made up. So just to kind of put that in perspective, this is what I while Sister Beverly was talking about the privilege and rights. This is what the thought just came to me, and I wrote it down. And it is this: yes, you talk about sex being a privilege within the marriage. And yes, by being married, you have certain, I can't find a better word, but rights. And so this is how I'm going to put, to try to harmonize those disparaging views. That is, the privilege of sex modifies the right to sex. So that, when you see the mutuality in the marriage as a privilege, because that's what I read from Ellen White. And you see that the enjoyment of the sexual relation is in, valuing that privilege. It doesn't take away the so-called right. What it does, it modifies it, because that right now becomes operationalized in the whole issue of neutrality. That is, yes, I am your husband, and I have certain desires, and there is the expectation for it to be satisfied in this marital relation. But that is modified by the fact that it's such a gift, it's such a privilege, that I don't want to mess it up by using force or to take it out of the balance of neutrality.
I think we have 6 more minutes. We clearly will need a part 2 of this discussion, because we haven't touched several aspects of it. I haven't asked yet about the possibility of a woman raping her husband and how that works, etc. I suppose that discussion is for part 2. But I want to go to the attorney, and then I will take a question or two from the audience. I want to go to the attorney because we need to make this very clear before we end this part 1 of this program. So attorney, how should we as Christians relate? I think you hinted to it already. We're Christians, and we should not necessarily wait on the state to determine what is right or wrong. I did say earlier that in some countries the discussion is on. In some places it's a crime under law books. You mentioned, for example, in the USVI, it's a crime under law books. So clearly various countries have different standards, but we are Christians. We are supposed to be above the, to put it differently, we should not have to wait on the state to legislate something to know right or wrong, because we have the Bible. So how should we as Christians relate to this situation? In other words, if a man wants to have sexual relations with his wife and she is not interested, does he have the right to force her?
Absolutely not. He does not. And the church, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that the role of the church, just generally, I think it's important to counsel persons in understanding how relationships should operate, how true love looks, what God expects of us as spouses, as persons, and how we respect our fellow human being. And I think that that's the premise of I know our message, and I think it should be any Christian organization or religious organization's message. The sad part about it is many of these laws that we have religious roots, and we have to play a role in counseling families and couples in understanding the proper context of sex, as Ms. Chan and Pastor Williams have already talked about. You spoke earlier about even like the history of these laws coming into place, and truthfully, it's not wrong to say that many of these amendments to these antiquated laws came about with the women's movement. And I'm not going to get into a debate as to whether women should be free or have rights or equal to men or whatever. But the reality of it is, if in fact this structure, if we agree that, if there are persons that agree that the structure should be as it is, that a man should be in charge, a woman should be submissive, then that should have operated in a context where women feel comfortable, they feel loved, they feel willing to engage in sexual intercourse or any other aspect of marriage in a loving context. But because women have been abused for so long under men who do not have Christ as their head, they feel like they themselves are the beginning, the alpha and the omega of their relationship. That's, I think in that context is where we've had the breakdown of the family, the marriage, And we've had women who've suffered for so long under abusive relationships, not just in the context of marital rape, but so many other types of abuse, that they, at some point, they were like, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I want to be free. I want to be able to manage my own body, my own life. I want to be able to work and spend money. And that's where we are now. And so now we're going through the process of changing those laws that have for so long kept women under these types of abuses. And I think that this Let's Talk program is a step in the right direction in getting the word out there. And we need to have many more of these discussions. There's still a lot of Caribbean islands that have these laws on the books. Antigua being one. I think St. Kitts has done away with it. St. Lucia still has it on the books. And I think it's important for us to preach what the proper context of love and marital sexual relations look like.
You know, I have a, thank you so much, attorney. Well said. I have a very good attorney friend who just sent me a very significant comment, and his comment was short and to the point. I stand at the door and knock, knock, knock. Even the creator has to knock. And the point he was making is that God created us, but he doesn't come into our hearts without our consent. And so neither should we try to enter the door without the consent of the one who is in charge of his or her own body there. Well, there is a question I want us to ask. Our time is just about up, but permit me to just squeeze this question in very quickly, and we only have a minute to deal with it. So here it is. I hope the folks in Second Advent permit us here. We are live in Second Advent, and I know that when 4 o'clock comes, they like to say that time is up. But this, I think, is an important question. So let me go ahead and ask it very quickly. And Pastor Williams, maybe as the theologian on the panel, you can answer it quickly, succinctly. Who or what governs sex in a marriage relationship? Who is in control of sex in the relationship?
God should be the one in control of the entire, not just the individual, but the marriage. And so when you speak of, because you see, you know, sex, and we haven't kind of gone into the mechanics as to how we must, view the sexual relation, but it's within the context of your spiritual relationship with God. And once that takes place, once that is factored in, then this discussion about whether it's rape or not becomes moot, because again, neutrality comes to the fore when God is the center of it.
Well, folks, I think that's all the time we have for today. I do want to say that next week's discussion, now I did say that we have a part 2 to this, but next week we do have another program lined up. Next week, we are going to be talking about the issue of abortion. You know, recently in North America, there is the reversal of the Supreme Court's long-standing, is it Wade versus who? Sister
Roe versus
Roe versus Wade, yes.
Wade.
And that has ignited a whole set of debates concerning whether a woman has the right to end her pregnancy or not. Next week, we're going to be talking about abortion. And perhaps after that, we will come back to the issue of marital rape, because we do have quite a bit to share. But I want to thank you. Thanks to those who are listening for joining. Please remember to join us next week right here on SLC Adventist and on Second Advent Radio. We hope next week to have our, I did say SLC Adventist, that's SLC Church channel. I do hope next week we have our SLC Adventist channel back up. But that's all the time we have for today. I look forward to seeing you next week. May God bless you. Be really good. Bye-bye.